Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Brittany Chisnall with the FreightWaves media team, and I'm happy to present this webinar in partnership with Uber Freight. Today, we will discuss navigating LTL disruption, what recent voids in capacity mean for shippers. I'm happy to be joined by Nathan Adams, Vice President of Transportation and Procurement at Uber Freight, and Matt Lowry, Director of LTL Procurement at Uber Freight. We will also have a live Q&A following the discussion, so make sure to have your questions ready for our presenters. Before we get started, I'd like to cover just a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you have any issues during the webinar, please feel free to access the help section or the audience chat function in your webinar console. If you have questions that you would like to ask our presenters, please enter those through the Q&A box in your console, and we will answer as many of those as possible during the live audience Q&A following the discussion. We'll also be sending a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow if you'd like to view it on demand or share it with your colleagues. At this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to our presenters to kick off today's discussion.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Thanks again for attending, and we're excited to be able to talk to you about this kind of a timely topic with everything going on in the LTL industry. I'll give myself a quick introduction, then I'll cover high level the agenda, what we hope to accomplish today, and then I'll pass it on over to Matt to introduce himself and kind of kick us off from a market standpoint. So again, my name is Nathan Adams. I'm the Vice President over Transportation and Procurement for Uber Freight, which includes the relationships with the motor carriers, both on the LTL and the truckload side, and really all modes, and then also the procurement world. We conduct probably 200, 250 RFPs on behalf of our customer base across all modes. So just through that process, our team gets together a lot of cool data insights and a lot of industry expertise just from working with the carriers and going through that. And also, managing our very large LTL network that we have here at Uber on behalf of our customers. And so this is a very timely discussion, especially with changes in the industry. Like everybody knows that Yellow has filed for bankruptcy. And so we'll touch on that a little bit, but again, just excited to have some open dialogue here and share some details, and so we'll jump right in. Okay, so from an agenda standpoint, doing quick introductions. We plan to cover down on the market update, both on supply and demand, kind of what we're seeing in those aspects, as well as what we feel rates are doing. And what they will do. Now, of course, nobody has a secret crystal ball, but we'll just kind of say what the industry indicators are kind of pointing to from a rate standpoint. We'll also talk about capacity in the marketplace in the LTL side of the house, and what the exit of Yellow has done to the capacity and what we feel it's going to do, even though it may not have had a massive impact right now, which Matt will show you in a second. We do expect it'll have some impacts on down the road. With that, we want to help everybody start to mitigate what increases or what capacity problems they could have as things start to tighten up in the industry. So we're going to go through some best practices and how to approach your carrier base, things to look internally at your network, and really focus on now when the market is not in the crazy point, knowing that we're probably going to be there here sooner than later. So probably some initiatives that we're going to kick off internally on our side, and we're going to recommend to our customers and partners that they do the same to help protect their network. Of course, we'll summarize it up at the end, and then we'll definitely have some time for some Q&A and really look forward to that open discussion. So I think now I'm going to pass it over to Matt Lowry and let him introduce himself, and then he's going to dive right into the market side of the business.
All right, great. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, I'm glad to be here today, and thank you for joining. Again, my name is Matt Lowry, so I oversee our LTL procurement and carrier management team at Uber Freight, and I've been with Uber Freight for a combination of 15 years through various acquisitions, and have held various roles in our pricing, carrier management of various different modes, in a variety of things. But over the past 8 years or so, had the privilege to manage our LTL team and be part of the tremendous growth that we've experienced in the LTL mode. So first, I'll go over a brief market update to see and share what we're seeing in the market. What we like to start off with is demand. So from the LTL perspective, what's going on from a demand perspective? What we use as a primary indicator is the PMI index. As you can see here, it gives a great indication, that top left chart, of predicting future LTL demand. So as the index is over 50, that means it's an expanding market and you should expect growth. And if it's under 50, it's a contracting market and you should expect reduced shipment volumes. And you can see over time that is a great indicator of LTL volume. This is the ninth consecutive month that it's been under 50. So we do expect reduced LTL volumes for the next several months, if not really through the end of the year into early next. Another indicator for LTL tonnage is truckload volume. Generally, the truckload segment moves first when volume's going up or down, and the LTL market is generally somewhere in the range of 3 to 6 months after that. And that was true back about a year ago as well, when the truckload market reduced volumes in the middle of last year. In the bottom left-hand chart is something you can see over time is tonnage and how it's reduced really from the highs of 21 and 22. And what we like to point out here is that as there were the unfortunate rumors of Yellow filing for bankruptcy, and ultimately it occurred, that the market itself, from the highs of 21 and 22 to what we're showing in Q1, had the capacity to take on that Yellow volume, and the overall Yellow tonnage was less than that gap. And that held true, that with very little interruption to service from what we've experienced, the other LTL carriers have been able to absorb that volume for the past 6 weeks or so. So the thing to really watch for is, as tonnage turns and it starts to increase, is really when carriers' capacity may begin to tighten much quicker than what we've historically seen in previous years and previous cycles. Mm-hmm. And again, here, Yellow represented about 9% of the market share and was the third largest LTL carrier. The next thing we'd like to talk about is supply. So what, from a carrier perspective, obviously removing the third largest carrier has an impact. You can see from the top left chart is fleet sizes over time. And from the highs of 21, the carriers have really adjusted to the lower volumes and reduced their overall fleet sizes. So carriers are very good at making those adjustments and adjusting their fleet and capacity to market conditions. Will take a little bit more time, and there is efforts and time to ramp up volume back up, but carriers are in the process of doing that. The top right graph is just overall of the public carriers terminals over time. So you can see over time the overall terminals have reduced and continue to reduce. The important factor here is that Yellow represented about 19% of those terminals, over 300 terminals, and I think about 160 or 170 of those were actually owned by Yellow, and the remainder were leased. So ultimately, you've read that Old Dominion is currently the leading bidder to acquire those terminals and land and tractors and trailers, and currently the bid's at about $1.5 billion. So what ultimately happens to that will help. It's expected to sell off those tractors and trailers and terminals over time, and carriers will ultimately, some may trade out. They might be wanting to go from a smaller one to a bigger terminal, because one of the big issues from an LTL carrier perspective to grow is finding land that is suitable for a trucking company and for a terminal. It's not an easy thing to do, is to find that land. And another headwind that carriers are facing is just the continued cost. Even though over the past 6-9 months, volume has been down, their costs continues to rise. And this is an example of a carrier's cost, but it is representative of the market that tractors and trailers and various different equipment, dock wages continue to go up, and that's something that needs to be managed. And the cost of ramping up. So as carriers have already seen over the past 6 weeks, many have provided mid-quarter updates, and that their volume is up overall in varying levels. So they have to ramp up that capacity from a driver perspective, and all of those things and those costs that are involved with growing your business. I mean, the expectation is that volume will also pick up to where they'll see that extra revenue as well. Next, we'll go over the rate outlook and what we're seeing in the market. First thing to understand is that Yellow represented, is really 4 independent companies, operating companies, that they were in the process of becoming one Yellow, one super regional carrier, LTL carrier. And those carriers represented Redaway, Holland, New Penn, and YRC. And so it's really 3 regional carriers: Redaway in the West, Holland in the Midwest, and New Penn in the Northeast. And then YRC is that national carrier that overlaid that really could go anywhere in the U.S. And they all provided cross-border Canada business as well. So, it's really taking, 4 segments and removing them from the market. So that's an important thing to understand. In the top left graph is the operating ratio for the public carriers. And it's important to understand, Yellow, you can see hovering right around 100, with Old Dominion just in the low 70s there. And then the bottom left is revenue per shipment. So unfortunately, Yellow had the highest operating ratio and the lowest of their national carrier peers from a revenue per shipment perspective. And what we expect from that is really putting that cost pressure off of some of all the remaining national LTL carriers, from having that lower cost option there. Obviously still very competitive in nature from a pricing perspective on both the national and regional perspective, but really takes some of that lower pressure out of the market. From a pricing perspective, if you were a big Yellow user, obviously you had to adjust, and presumably, in some cases you've been able to get close or match the pricing, but in many cases you had to readjust to a higher cost option that was available. What we're seeing, really because of demand being at where it was, that the first half of the year, from a contractual renewal perspective, about 3 to 5% increase. And then, we expect and are seeing this to that pricing behavior really with very few exceptions of being in that 3 to 5% range. Now, LTL carriers are very disciplined in pricing. So if a piece of business doesn't work, or as their networks change, because carriers' networks will change over time, really over the next several months, their networks will change. An interesting stat that came out just this week from public carriers' mid-quarter updates is that you start to see the volume getting into these other carriers' networks, and the average weight per shipment is moving down. So presumably, Yellow had an overall lower weight per shipment, and it's getting to these larger public national carriers. But ultimately, what we see from an outlook perspective from pricing is that, as volume and as tonnage increases, the pricing will uptick, from that 3 to 5% range. But we just have not seen that yet from a pricing perspective. Then next, I'll turn it over to Nathan.
All right. Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump to the next slide. And so just to kind of talk about like capacity and rates and how do we like bundle all this together and think about it. So when I think about it, I think what Matt said around, okay, utilization or capacity in the LTL industry has been on the decline, right? Amazingly, Yellow was 9 to 10% of the total industry. We've probably dropped about that much over the past couple of years of throughput. So it's kind of like, it almost feels like, okay, now we're equal again, right? And so now we're equal. I think we've seen that with working with the carriers. Most of them have honored their rate agreements and their contracts and been great partners, knowing that there's all these cost pressures that are going to come down the road, right? And so back to another one of Matt's points is that, okay, so if we're, consider it equilibrium of capacity, the second things start to pick back up economically or from a freight perspective, like it's just going to accelerate those rate increases and the pressure in the LTL networks, right? And so I think that's where we want to talk through, even though it feels okay right now, like we feel there's probably going to be some pressure growing, especially in the next year. And what do we need to do to help mitigate, rate pressures and capacity pressures, and how do we work with our carriers better? So that's kind of how I try to sum all that up, knowing that like, yeah, it's okay now. Nobody's really come with major rate increases across the board. Everybody's on their contracts. That we have had some one-offs on certain accounts, certain lanes where carriers have come and said we just can't stomach the low OR on these rates, and we've been working with folks. But I would expect more of that to become prevalent as things start to pick up. And I'd say, here's just a few reasons kind of why it is, right? And why things are maybe reacting the way they are. Some folks may be seeing increased rates, especially due to the market hype, right? Obviously taking 10% of the market out of LTL is a major impact to the supply. And so we just got to kind of wait for demand to catch up to get that other side of the pressure. The shippers that are really reliant on Yellow, as Matt kind of illustrated in the before, Yellow was they had a higher OR, lower revenue per shipment. And so when they kind of go out of the marketplace, there may not be another low priced option on that lane, right? And so folks are going to start seeing rate increases to where they may not have another player in that lane or another low cost provider, and they may have to switch to one of the other providers or do something different to try to keep that down. So yeah, the third bullet point there, shippers relying on Yellow have probably likely had to switch to some higher priced carriers and take some increases in the short term. So kind of what can limit it, right? So like understanding the market hype, like we're talking about now, and kind of what the true impacts are and how to have those conversations with the carriers, understanding the supply and demand we went through, the rate stability, and kind of how all that pricing really starts to impact your company at the rate level, right? And how does that all come to fruition, and how do you start to mitigate and not just take rate increases, but actually work with the LTL carriers to better your network, better their network, and get the right pieces of the puzzle into back in the network and try to mitigate this as much as possible. So I'm going to jump into kind of the LTL best practices, right? So, so more of the same, right? From a theme standpoint, as your demand increases and supply reduces, it's critical to help your LTL process, understand your freight characteristics, and how do you make sure you're positioned in the marketplace, right? And that's where we hope to talk through some of these best practices and actions we can take to really avoid the disruptions that you could potentially see, throughout the end of the year and going in next year. So the first piece we'll cover is just, how do you tactically route, right? And how do you adjust your current routing guide to meet your cost of service objectives? Everybody has their routing guide set up in a different way. Different options, different carriers, regional, national, and some other things there. But it's how do you, by pulling yellow out, how do you fill that void? And really it is, how do you find the best cost provider that can still give you the capacity and service on those lanes that you really want? So it's understanding of kind of what may have exited your network from a capacity standpoint with yellow, and understand where, what that is moving on today. How is that running? What is my cost increase, and how do I go to mitigate that? Do I want to mitigate it? Am I good with it, right? So it's really a lot of internal looking upon your own network. Second thing is really focusing on how do you optimize your routing, right? There obviously are there options. There's new cost factors in play. So assuming you potentially took increased costs on certain lanes, there may be some different optimization and different routings that are now an option that may not have been, right? Because you've maybe had a cheap cost with yellow before, right? So it's even more important to look at, multi-stop truckload or pooling. We've put our OptiPro product out there who can always help your teams do that from our side if that's an option and you like to have that discussion. We have that service in-house. But it really is kind of going back and looking at your internal load building and how do you route and make sure it's all aligned with the kind of the new world in LTL, and does it go back and meet your cost and service objectives? I'd say is, anything with change, point number 3 is expect some service deterioration, right? Expect some pickup delays. If demand really takes off, there's going to be embargoes in the marketplace where folks just are out of balance in their LTL network, right? And so that's what the LTL carriers are really working hard to do, is understand, okay, with all this freight that's potentially coming in the network, where can I take it? When can I take it? And at what cost can I take it? And so with that becomes just some delays and making sure you have the right capacity allocated at the right places. So, plan for that. Expect there's going to be a little bit of service issues, potentially leverage some high service carriers in the meantime until you can get the network stable. And next bullet feeds into that too, is how do you build flexibility within the network, right? And how do you react to those market changes, and how do you have good depth of carriers? So I'd say if you are single threaded from a routing standpoint, it's probably a good time to really take a step back, look at the routing, how much depth do you have on the LTL side of the house? Because this is a good time to establish those relationships with the LTL providers and get them into your network, and really form those partnerships. That's going to help with the market changes that are upcoming. Last on this slide is just, how do you communicate with the carrier base? From our standpoint, it's the more communication you can give, the better. And how do you communicate with them, and how do you understand what your network looks like, what's growing and changing in your network, whether it be different manufacturing facilities or different lanes or different areas of growth. We all know our networks change, and we have to maintain them every year. So it's how do you have that discussion with the LTL carriers to make sure they're prepared to support your business, understand where they are over and under capacity due to all these changes, and really work to help form that partnership on both sides of the network changes.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, as we, add on to that communication piece, this is really, it's a relationship business. There's a lot of tech and different things and strategies that can be implemented, but really to have that relationship with your carrier base, and that can be at different levels too. There could be certain levels within your organization. You have a certain relationship, but then have that communication at the local level as well, or maybe at the freight payment and collections level as well. So varying different levels of communications as appropriate as well. The next thing that we'll talk through is origin optimization. So what can you do to really optimize at the pickup location? First thing, timely and effective communication. It used to be the thought process, I'll call at 3. LTL carrier can pick up by 5. That's my 2 hours notice, and we'll be good. They'll pick up and they'll be on their way, and things, the shipment will be delivered on the posted transit time. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. LTL carriers are getting much more, implementing much more technology within their processes, and they're using the electronic orders that are being sent over, and that's why they're wanting very specific information regarding the number of pallets, weight, where it's going, so they can not only optimize their pickup routes to pick up most efficiently and to ensure that the enough capacity is within that pickup trailer. So you don't get stuck with not being able to load your entire shipment in that trailer, but also they're pre-planning their line hauls for that night already. As they're picking up in the afternoon, that line haul planning has already started. So getting that information, really the day before or early in the morning will really help you to ensure that your freight not only gets picked up that day, but gets on that line haul truck that evening. Leverage technology and optimization. Nathan had mentioned multi-stop truckload pooling. And one thing with the pooling, sometimes, with different market conditions and in 1 year, it may be the cost-effective way to go. And then in 2 years, it may not. So you do have to constantly look at that. In electronic bill of lading, that's becoming really the standard from a technology perspective. There's a standardization, there's a standard API for the EBOL, and getting that information, all that bill of lading level information to the carrier electronically, so they're not manually keying things in. Want to really stop all the manual entries that are occurring within the entire LTL process. Another thing here from leverage the optimization process, what some shippers do is load by the day of the week. So going to the West Coast, ships on Friday, to the Northeast is maybe Monday. So they're able to improve those pooling multi-stop truckloads, as well as direct loading for the trailer. So they may be able to load the trailer from an LTL carrier for them, essentially. So you miss that, so that LTL carrier doesn't have to unload and reload that trailer. Avoid minimum charge shipment size shipments. Now that is something, obviously I think everyone want to avoid, but they're more costly, especially if it's just a one minimum charge shipment, one pickup at that location. So look at ways, if you're shipping to the same location 5 times a week, can you ship only 2 or 3 times or once a week and build that density for that shipment and ultimately reduce that cost per hundredweight. And there's different programs out there that can motivate your customers in order to do that. Bill of lading and labeling quality, that is one of the biggest things that we're seeing right now, an area of opportunity to really being able to have that perfect bill of lading, because it really starts with that bill of lading. That starts the billing perspective from a carrier perspective. So having that accurate product description, NMSC number, class, and the NMSC numbers change quarterly, and many of them are density based now. So and I think one of the biggest challenges for a shipper is that you may not know your density on the shipment by shipment level, but getting to that information there. Electronic pro numbers, if you're not familiar with those, it's really just systematically having the pro number and barcode already on the bill of lading. So the carrier, all they got to do, you've already sent it electronically to the carrier, that shipment with all the details. They show up. All they have to do is scan, and that pro number should be on the handling unit and bill of lading. So it's essentially a paperless process from there. If you have enough volume, you want to use drop trailers, and you want to use that trailer to, the full trailer, not just load it, 50%. Fast in and out times, be aware of carriers' time. They can charge attention, but they don't really want to. And that's measured within the costing systems of, how much are you tying up the driver. And from a pickup perspective, sometimes carriers will just leave. If they don't think they're going to load, well, they have 10 other pickups to pick up after you. So they're going to move on. So it's really important to be able to move along those drivers. And then, without saying, just treat drivers with courtesy and respect. Next, we'll talk about packaging improvement. The big thing here is density. So that pounds per cubic foot of a shipment, that is one of the biggest drivers of cost from a carrier perspective that ultimately drives the pricing that is provided. So if you have opportunity to improve the density of your handling unit, you want to really investigate that. You really want to understand that, of how you are packaging a pallet in order to improve the density. Because most larger regional and national carriers, they have dimensionizers, and they're systematically weighing and dimming out all the pieces of freight on the dock. And most carriers are in excess of 80% of the shipments are going through these dimensioners. So they have a good idea on your density. So any improvement will be directly related to your pricing that you'll be able to offer the next go around, because that does directly relate to that operating ratio. If you ship pieces of freight over 8 feet in length, you were likely made aware of this over the past couple of years as capacity tightened. So in some cases, 8 feet, 12 feet pieces of freight are unavoidable, but understand that they are harder to handle for carriers. And if you can somehow reduce that, you want to be able to do that, because those are becoming and have become very costly. From a damage perspective, is first off, just understanding, know your baseline. What is your claims ratio? Claims ratio is generally measured in two different ways. Number of damaged shipments, divided by the total number of shipments hauled, or the dollar amount claimed versus the total revenue of that carrier. So you just want to understand those metrics, understand what's occurring, and then meet with a packaging expert. Many carriers have packaging experts on hand that you can consult for free of charge. So you just want to understand what's occurring and why it's occurring. And then obviously just clear and legible labels, that every handling unit, every piece of freight has a label on it in case it does get disconnected from the rest of that label. And without saying, timely freight payment, freight payment is probably one of the biggest heartaches from an LTL side across the industry. And when we talked about the e-bill of lading and automation of LTL, that will help freight payment because everything then is electronic. There's no manual intervention. So that is, something that will become to, more and more into the future. It'll be more heavily adopted. But, standard is 30-day. Many carrier standards are 15-day, but it's just regardless of what your payment terms are with the carrier, but to pay in that timely fashion.
Okay, I will. This is our last slide, and then I'll summarize this. And just to call out, if you guys have Q&A, please go ahead and load it in the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll be able to get to those. I see quite a few already building up, so thank you again for the participation. So last slide, again, we've hit on some of these around pricing strategy and how do you really take your network and look at it and say, okay, how should I price this? I go to again, LTL freight. How do you align it to your business strategy? Like, how do you make sure that it is the correct economic order quantity? What is your freight spend, route optimization, load optimization, and really trying to make that as efficient as possible, because that should all feed into your pricing strategy, right? Mitigating some of the more difficult shipments. If there's other options for you, then I'd say that it's a good time to take a look at them. Again, I hit on routing guide strategy earlier. Like, how deep are you in your routing guide? Do you have enough players at the right cost capacity? Have you had those conversations with those carriers to ensure that they understand the routing guide and understand the freight requirements? Third bullet there at the top, do you do an RFP versus a renewal, right? It's always one of the big questions in LTL, right? Is, do I renew or do I go to RFP? And I think part of that is what are the rates doing at the time? What's the capacity doing at the time? And how can you drive that renewal? And what does that look like versus taking it to RFP? And that's some of the internal strategy discussions really to get behind and understand your company's personal pricing and understand what that would look like if you did go to an RFP, potential exposure there, but the potential savings, and then versus what it would be from a renewal standpoint. Of course, all taking into account the capacity that is so needed, right? And then, obviously understand the impact of the accessorials. Every carrier has different sets of accessorials and different costs. And so as you all are doing your pricing and just make sure that's a key factor that you look at. And that way there's no surprise cost and built into the model when you go forward and do it. With that, another big one is the collaboration. I think we had this throughout the presentation. It's a really good time to establish your kind of key partners, renew relationships, have your top to tops, right? Get aligned with your core carriers, and really work with them to, I think Matt mentioned on the previous slide, how do you improve efficiencies? The carriers are very good because they're the ones touching the freight. They're the ones moving it across their dock. They know where we're being inefficient from a shipper standpoint, and how can we go and fix that, right? And some of it's fixable and some of it's not, but let's at least challenge our carriers to call out where we're causing problems in their network and how we can potentially adjust, right? And get that extra set of eyes, which kind of goes to the third bullet of building trust with your carriers and having that collaborative relationship that goes both ways. A big one that we're focused on here at Uber Freight is improving that integration and how do you get more APIs set in and pre-pro options just to make things flow more smoothly between the companies and in and out of the LTL network. And then I mentioned the top to top and make your relationships at the right level of the organization, get your leadership involved, get your supply chain leadership, potentially executives outside your supply chain to really understand the importance of the LTL market and what that's like to partner with some of these large carriers and large suppliers, and how do you build those top to top relationships. So obviously there's a lot there to take in and a lot to try to work through as we kind of move into the summary. So just to summarize, I won't drain this whole thing, but again, we talked about the supply and demand. Demand is down currently, even with the capacity exiting the marketplace, but it's very close to the equilibrium. So any kind of upticks in the demand is definitely going to set forth capacity issues, pricing discussions, inefficiency discussions, and all that good stuff that we covered. Again, supply is down to the yellow. Carriers are ramping up. Matt mentioned earlier on the potential sale of yellow. Right, it definitely won't be a 1-for-1 for whoever buys them. They're not going to utilize every terminal, so there is going to be a permanent exit of capacity out of the market, right? And due to that, the rates will adjust, right, based on the tonnage and the new equilibrium within the market and kind of how all that levels out. So there's going to be some rate changes, and we kind of give you our prediction on what we're seeing and what we feel we're going to see. And then the last one, I can't iterate enough. Now's the time. Back half of this year, beginning of next year, really start to optimize your LTL network. working with your carriers, understand your inefficiencies, understand your demand needs from a shipper standpoint, and really start to map that out and work with your carrier partners to ensure you have the right routing guides in place, the right pricing, the right contracts. Mentioned the renewals versus the RFP, and come in to formulate all those different strategies. So again, I think we'll probably hand it back over to Brittany at this point. I see a lot of questions building in the Q&A, so thank y'all for that. And as we're getting into them, please continue to ask questions, and we'll get to them as many as we can. So Matt, if you don't have anything else on your side, I'd say we'll hand it back over to Brittany and go to Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Really great insights here. But yeah, at this point, we would like to take some time for some questions from the audience. So if you haven't already submitted your questions, please type those in the Q&A section in your console. But yes, it does look like we have a few so far. So we'll start with the first one. Where do you see M&A in LTL?
Yeah, I can start with that. I can see I've got a few different examples. We'll get into the yellow terminal and equipment sales too. Knight Swift has notated in their earnings calls that obviously they own Midwest Motor Express and AAA Cooper, and they look to expand and create a national coverage, national brand with coverage. So they will continue to grow. We fully expect that to grow and to fill in that map. Cross Country is a carrier that many may not be familiar with. They cover a large geographic territory from the Dakotas, Montana, all the way down south, through Missouri, and they have grown over the past 3 to 5 years through acquisition. And their model have been really acquiring small carriers with 1 to 3 terminals. And they just recently made an acquisition last month that was a smaller carrier in St. Louis. So I expect them to continue. Earlier this year, 2 Northeast carriers combined, Rist and AMA. So expect that to continue, especially as these smaller regional LTL carriers. And then the obvious thing, there's going to be a lot of terminals and equipment available in the very near future. Mentioned earlier with Old Dominion having the bid of $1.5 billion, but that will open up opportunity to grow organically, because there'll be those terminals, and some are likely in very, very desirable areas, and that can really build that organic growth. So it's not necessarily through direct M&A, but it's will expand carriers' geographic reach.
Awesome. Moving on to the next question. Do you see any new carriers entering into the LTL market?
Yeah, I can start with that one too. From a traditional LTL carrier perspective, no, it's very capital and intense to enter into. For the land, the terminals, the tractors, the trailers. But what we might see is some niche players, from consolidators, partial truckload volume carriers, or technology providers. There's a variety of different carriers to build to fill in the void of that long haul national that YRC had. So there may be some very specific, coast to coast or maybe Midwest area to the West Coast that are very metro to metro specific, last mile. So not from the traditional sense, but to fill in niches and potentially from a technology side of things can really, I see that we're be entering the market.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. There have been talk about the parcelization of LTL. What are your thoughts on this? And do you see this happening in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I can jump on that one, Matt. I think when we refer to parcelization, I think mainly around the technology side of the house, and there is quite a bit of technology advancements going on, especially around the connectivity world and how do we better connect as shippers with our LTL carriers through API for tracking, appointment scheduling, payment and all that, right? So there is a heavy push to try to move things to more of an automated environment, right, between both the LTL carriers and the shippers. I know that started to take hold with some of the API work and some of the standards that are getting rolled out in the industry. So yeah, I'd say 3 to 5 years is probably going to be a pretty heavy focus on how do we better integrate our technologies together between shipper and carrier, and really try to take a lot of the manual pieces out of that, right, to make it more like the parcel environment, at least from a technology standpoint. So I know we're excited about it from Uber Freight. We're a very, very large LTL shipper, and work with our carriers. I know they're excited to help push us forward and gain efficiencies on both sides of the house.
Thanks, Nathan. Next question, how do you see labor impacting the LTL market or drivers over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I can start, Matt, and maybe jump in. But you think about the driver world and the capacity. I think we touched on just when you talk about overall capacity and doors and facilities and barriers to entry, right? Like a lot of that stuff is standard, and then your driver base can be a wild card, right? And so when you look at a driver in the industry, it's not necessarily a driver in the LTL industry. It's more in the broader trucking industry. And I think we've all seen, a few years ago, a lot of the OTR truckload drivers shifting to, P&D drivers for LTL because it can be home every night, right? So inherently, LTL has a little more preferable type of work when you get, as far as a trucker goes. They have more day cabs. It's more, pickup and delivery type work, local work versus the long haul piece of it. Not saying that they don't get involved in that in some form or fashion at times, but yeah, I'd say, the driver world is always a very interesting world. It feels like it's stable now, but as we know, 3 to 5 years is a way out, and like we saw with the pandemic and some other pressures, those numbers can change very quickly depending on what's going on in the marketplace. But right now, I would say drivers are pretty stable, especially in the LTL world, because it can be a little more advantageous for a person to go and drive for an LTL company versus a long haul truckload company, right? So you tend to see the truckload guys see the pressure first, and then it can trickle down to the LTL side of the house. And then another piece is the dock labor, right? And maybe Matt, if you don't mind covering a little bit of the history on that piece and anything I may miss on the driver's side.
Yeah, and I'll just add on the driver's side too, on the line haul piece as well. It's also desirable because most time they're meet and turns, or they're home every night or every other night, and it's very predictable in its nature. So it is a desirable job versus just an over-the-road truckload driver. Yeah, and then certainly from a dock worker perspective, in many cases, what LTL carriers are doing is they have programs where you start as a dock worker. They'll actually put you to driver school. Many of the larger carriers have their own driving schools, and then you work towards becoming a driver. So those programs have been very successful for a variety of LTL carriers, and that really helps increase their labor pool. And they have a career path from day one as a dock worker.
Awesome. Thank you both. The next question is Uber Freight seeing carriers being more selective with what freight they will or will not accept since Yellow's bankruptcy?
Yeah, I'd say short answer is yes, right? So you have a lot of the carriers have gone in and started to look at where they can and can't add freight into their network, right? So especially at the time of bankruptcy, when all the rumors were flying around, there was a lot of pressure, a lot of pricing requests from carriers, a lot of capacity requests from carriers. And they had to pick and choose, right, based on what their network could handle at that time. So yeah, there definitely was a very selective action from the LTL carriers, especially on the front end of this thing. And then as things start to stabilize, right, it's going to, I'm not saying they won't be still very selective. It may ease up a bit, but they are going to be very, do a lot of analytics around what's good freight and what's bad freight, right? And so they're going to be trying to figure out what's the most profitable freight, what's the most advantageous freight for our network. So yeah, I continue to see them picking and choosing, and that kind of goes back to where, how do you have a deep routing guide? How do you get the right carriers involved in your network? How do you have the discussions and have good partnerships across it, right? So it's not just one carrier can make or break certain lanes in your network.
Yeah, and I think we learned a lot during COVID, and where carriers, that from a freight perspective, that's when we talked about we're really making your freight profile better from a density perspective. The extreme length were really hit on hard in 2021 and 22. And carriers really didn't want, they charged additional fees to really get that freight out of their network. So you see carriers becoming a little bit more pickier as demand increases and their networks are full because they want to fill it with the right freight. And just going beyond that, it's just knowing your consignee, your customer base. Some carriers do really well in the grocery warehouses and retailers and even specific retailers, and some carriers don't. So you want to structure that and both from your perspective and the carrier side, they may want to go here, but not here.
Awesome. We got another Yellow question here. What do you foresee will be the future for Yellow's assets?
Yeah, Matt, I know you touched on it a little bit earlier. I'll reiterate a few points, and obviously we don't know for sure. I think the industry is kind of waiting on it. There's a couple bids out there. I think you mentioned Old Dominion is kind of reportedly the high bidder. Obviously, there's a lot of things to work through on the L side, on the bankruptcy and the selling off of real estate. I do think the pieces will get sold, right? And whoever decides to buy them is going to leverage what is in that network to what fits their network, and they're probably going to sell off the rest. So you think of what Yellow was doing, right, and trying to merge those four carriers into one major carrier. They had definite terminal duplication across the carriers, and terminals that were very, very close to each other. And so it's if you go and take hold of those assets, how many doors do you need in that market, right? And that's the decision the carriers are going to have to say, okay, so now I've bought X number of doors in this market. How many more do I need to go and run the business I think I'm going to need to do, right, based on the demand? So I do think those are going to get sold off. I don't think it's going to be a one-for-one where it's just an operating terminal for Yellow becomes an operating terminal for somebody else. There'll definitely be a reduction in the overall real estate footprint of legacy Yellow assets. But then that's really going to help carriers accelerate their expansion, whoever decides to buy them. But then, yeah, they're also going to be selling off some of that real estate that they purchase as well. So, Matt, anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered that well.
Awesome. Does Uber have a forecast for how much LTL rates may increase through end of year as a result of market disruptions?
Yeah, this was touched on a little bit, but we feel that LTL renewals will be in that 3 to 5% range through the end of the year. It may uptick more as industry LTL demand overall moves up, but that's where the majority of the renewals are coming. And in general, LTL carriers agreements are good for a period of 12 months, and they're very good about honoring those agreements. There could be certainly, as each customer of theirs is unique, right? So it's understanding, especially if you have a new carrier to the mix, or they're getting a different freight mix and things change to where there may be pockets where it's higher than that, maybe pockets where they're lower, but as carrier networks may change through getting different freight that they may have never seen in the past, but in general we're seeing that 3 to 5%.
Awesome. What do you think the long-term impact on door capacity will be in the LTL market?
that relates to the sale of all the yellow assets. And when you have over 300 terminals that will become available, not only many carriers will be looking at that, may have a terminal in that city, but it may be a 50-door terminal, and they really want to have a 100-door terminal, so they really might just upgrade, really not, and then sell their terminal. But ultimately, many regional carriers have over the past few years and continue to increase their door capacity, whether that is current terminals, adding to those, or just adding new terminals to broaden their within their current footprint, but just to make that, have it add another terminal within their current area to have a stronger service, have more next day points, a shorter P&D route time. So certainly many carriers are continue to grow and have continued to grow, and we expect that.
Awesome. This is the last question of the day. I thought the first slide had said tonnage would decline. Can you explain why you think LTL tonnage will increase?
Yeah, so LTL transportation in general is very cyclical in nature. So in the short term, the indicators are that it's going to remain low, the overall tonnage, but at a certain point, it will increase. And that has proven time and time again to where transportation is very cyclical in nature.
Yeah, I think it's, if you look at that, that chart now, it's kind of like, it is declining. We feel we're probably near the bottom, right? And so then we feel going into next year, just due to demand in the U.S. and demand in the marketplace with the exit of capacity and some of the other economic indicators and forecasting, that it's just feels like at some point we'll come out of this kind of freight downturn that we've been in, and it'll start to right size itself, right? And that's when we feel a lot of the pressures are gonna come back into the market, especially on the LTL side with the capacity missing. So yeah, absolutely correct that it's still kind of in the downwards trend. We feel like it's kind of close to hitting the bottom, where we're saying, hey, we're close to equal, but just due to the cyclical nature, it's bound to pick up at some point in time. Obviously we can't pinpoint exactly, but we're assuming Q1 and Q2 it's going to be increasing. It's kind of all the projections both on LTL and the rest of the freight industry.
Awesome. All right, well, that's excellent, guys. Thank you so much. That is all the time that we have for today. Big thank you to everyone again for taking the time to listen in. And big thank you to Nathan and Matt for sharing your insights with us today. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone tomorrow via the email you used to register with. And we hope you guys will join us again next time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Great. Thank you.